This is Damon Fordham, adjunct professor of history at Charleston Southern University in the Citadel. And I'm here to talk about healing and the root of the problem. About 2008, I was speaking with a very wise man here in Charleston, a fellow by the name of Mr. James Campbell. For those of you who don't know, he was one of the adult education directors of Malcolm X's Organization of African American Unity, before he came back after he taught in Tanzania and then came to Charleston, where I met him as a young man in the 1990s. Well, in 2008, if you'll recall, President Barack Obama was in his first run for the presidency. And early in the presidency, he faced a lot of doubt from a lot of African Americans. I remember earlier one day, I heard a number of black men saying, "Man, who does he think he is calling himself running for president? Man, he know he don't have no chance, etc., etc." So I saw Mr. Campbell later that day, and I told him about this, and I said, "Why aren't these guys giving him a chance?" And Mr. Campbell said something that I want you to think about. He said that many of us as black people in America are living in what he called a culture of despair. A culture of despair. What he was referring to was the fact that the slavery and segregation experience, and keep in mind, you have a lot of adults today who are old enough to remember the hardcore days of segregation. They had the idea that they were inferior or less than other people burned into their minds by the world around them. And many of their own parents believed that and passed that all down to children, because as George Schuyler said in his book Black Empire back in 1936, the average person only knows what they see and what they hear. And if what they see and what they hear is negativity, you got a hot mess going. But you know, in order to deal with the cure for a problem, you have to find the cause. So let's talk about it. You see, 600 years ago, the world did not know of the concept of race. They dealt with people on grounds of nationality, of tribe, of religion, or social class, or gender. You know, they knew that an European looked different than an Ethiopian, but it was not that big a deal of the color of the skin up until about the 1500s, when you had the early days of the transcontinental slave trade and such going on. And on Christopher Columbus's third voyage, he had a sailor named Bartolomé de Casas. And Bartolomé was a Spanish priest. And he was disgusted by the way Columbus was treating the Native Americans down in the Caribbean. So he had a solution: go to Africa and use the blacks instead. Well, in his book, The History of the Indies, around 1527, he confessed that he made a terrible mistake and begged God to forgive him for the pain that he had inflicted on the African people through his suggestion. But it was too late. So during the early years of the English settlement of America, the white indentured servants who would work for 7 years to pay off debts and petty crimes were working in the field with blacks, and they were getting along quite swimmingly. But then a number of them ran away with a black man named John Punch, and they were arrested. And it turns out that they gave the black man John Punch a longer sentence than that of the white runaways. They sentenced him to slavery for life. You see, ladies and gentlemen, according to James Oliver Horton and Loris Horton in their book Slavery and the Making of America, this is where the divide slowly started beginning. Because you see, the wealthy white planters who ran colonial America feared that these enslaved blacks and these indentured white servants would come together and overthrow them. So to prevent that from happening, they would give the poor whites more privileges than they did the enslaved blacks. And thus they would encourage the poor whites to look down on the blacks. In other words, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. And that's what racism is all about, Charlie Brown. But to make matters worse, You had people like James Henry Hammond, who got up in the U.S. Senate from South Carolina. He was a slave owner, and said that in every class of people, you needed a class to be educated to do the thinking of society, and you need what he called the mudsill of society that would do all the dirty work that would get no education at all so that they could do the handwork of society. And he said that these two forces were needed to keep society going. And he said that fortunately in the South, we have a race for the purpose of the mudsill. And he was talking about black slavery. And in order to keep this going, Woodrow Wilson would remark in 1909, on January the 9th, 1909, at a meeting for teachers in New York before he became president. And he said, quote, "We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a very much larger class of necessity in every society, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and fix themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks." In other words, educate one part of society to be the rulers and another part of society to be the ruled. But in order to do that, they had to take the step further by making the black people believe that they were inferior to the whites so that they would stay in this position as a permanent class of cheap labor. When the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was illegal with Brown versus Board of Education, May 17, 1954, here are the words of Chief Justice Earl Warren. "To separate children from others of similar age and qualifications simply because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in their community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone." And this is why Martin Luther King said in a sermon that he gave in Detroit, Michigan, June 23, 1963, "Many Negroes lost faith in themselves and considered themselves inferior." In the autobiography of Malcolm X, in the chapter marked Save, Malcolm said these words, "Little black children saw before they can talk that their parents considered themselves inferior." And many to this day believed that they were falsely cursed to be black because of this thing in the Bible where I believe it was Genesis in the 9th chapter where Noah was supposed to curse one of his sons, saying, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall your children be." Well, as an elder once pointed out to me, if you read that part of the Bible correctly, Noah was drunk when he made that curse. So you think God's going to listen to a drunk man's curse? Hello. So even though you have things in history that prove such things as, say, the success of the Marcus Garvey movement had, or the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, or the success of the 1963 and 1995 marches on Washington, D.C., you still have black people telling their children, well, black people can't unite to save their lives. Why? Because they were told that as children. And again, what you see and what you hear is what you know, oftentimes as a child. And President Barack Obama, in a speech that he gave before the Democratic Convention, July the 27th, 2004, said these words, that he expected the desire to eradicate the slander that a black youth with a book is acting white. Well, guess what? That's the story of my childhood. I went through that, certainly. Why? Because, again, in order to keep them as a permanent class of cheap labor, they convinced many black people that they were good with all things physical, but nothing mental. And many to this day, deep down in their hearts, believe that. So, how do we kill that kind of negative thinking? Through a simple word: education. And I don't mean that randomly, but I mean in a specific sense. It's not widely known that, for example, that slavery existed in both the northern and southern United States in the early years of America. And the reason slavery didn't exist in the North after 1827 is because in the 1770s, there was an enslaved woman named Mom Bet who heard up in Boston, who heard talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all men are created equal. So she got a lawyer named Sedgwick and sued for her freedom on the grounds that the Declaration of Independence applied to her, and there was no reason why it shouldn't. She won, and she won her freedom and changed her name to Elizabeth Freeman to show her new status. Well, guess what? Mom Bet couldn't read or write, but yet through hearing and knowledge, she was able to, knowledge from what she heard, she turned that to her advantage, and that led to a chain of events that would eventually lead New York to be the last northern state to end slavery in 1827, so that that part of American history is almost completely unknown today. Now, a lot of you who are into black history know about a fellow named Benjamin Banneker, born a free black scientist in Maryland, 1731. Well, get this. Not only did he invent the first clock in the colonial America, he also wrote an almanac that predicted the weather and told farmers when to plant and things like that. Well, sometime in around the 1780s, he read Thomas Jefferson's book, Notes of Virginia, where Jefferson made claims about the inferiority of black people, saying that, again, we were good at all things physical and nothing mental, and basically put black people on the beast level. Benjamin Banneker responded by sending Jefferson a letter that included his almanac. And guess what? Jefferson had to confess to Benjamin Banneker in a letter that he wrote back to him in 1791 that he was wrong about his beliefs of black people after seeing the genius of Benjamin Banneker. You can find that in a book called The African American Experience, Black History and Culture Through Speeches, Editorials, Poems, Songs, and Stories by Kai Wright, which was written in 2009. So things like this basically put the lie to the idea that black people are good at all things physical and nothing mental, and that we can't unite and all these other things. And you have to understand this, folks. James Brown would have never said, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud," if there was no such thing as black shame. Okay? Jesse Jackson would have never had to go around saying, "I am somebody," if so many people didn't believe that they were nobody. You would never hear people talk about black kings and black queens had they not been treated so long like black peasants. And people would have never, and say what you will about the organization, but people would have never gone around saying Black Lives Matter if for so long, for many people, Black lives didn't matter. And I really believe that those of us who know this history, if we sometimes would get out of the ivory tower and go out to your average Jane and your average Joe and teach them this history through means like what I'm doing right now in a language that the average Jane and the average Joe could understand, that would go a long way in solving this inferiority complex that exists among the people. And so, and I really believe that that would help make this a better nation, a better world. But in order for that to work, the people themselves will have to want to be educated and respect and be receptive to this kind of knowledge and information. So these stories may not be in the classroom today, and as a matter of fact, a lot of people right now are trying to keep them out of the classroom. But you know what? They are libraries. They are bookstores. They are documentaries on reputable television networks such as Public Broadcasting System that are done by professional, knowledgeable historians. And you can go to your library and ask the reference desk for good, solid, respected books on this type of history. And all of these things will add to your storehouses of knowledge and serve as weapons in the war on ignorance and the war on this culture of despair, so that way we can have a better future. To learn more about it, read my essay on this subject in this book called Ukulele, Searching for Healing Truth. It's edited by the late Horace Mungeon and a good friend of mine named Herb Frazier. There's an essay in there where I talk about all of this. So, look it up online and you can get the book and learn about it. And best of all, when you learn things like this, put it into practice. This is Damon Fordham.